Do you often think in extremes? And if you noticed, I didn't say do you always think in extremes, because that would be extreme thinking. But in any case, if you often think in extremes, if you think if I achieve this, life's going to be great. And if I don't achieve it, I'm a total failure and everything's going to be lousy from now on. Well, that's all or nothing thinking. And all or nothing thinking is one of those cognitive distortions that leads to anxiety, depression, holds us back in life, all sorts of stuff. And it's very common. I think it partially is common because our brains like to simplify things for us. It likes to make things a little bit easier because there's so much complexity and so much out there that if we just sort of say like, boom, all or nothing, maybe it's just a little easier on our brains. But it's not easier on us because it leads to a lot of problems, and ultimately, it's not accurate. So I want to talk about why all or nothing thinking is so dangerous, and then also like what's the reality, and I'm going to give you 4 tips to change this type of thinking. The biggest dangers of all or nothing thinking are that it makes us feel hopeless and it holds us back in life. If I think I have to get 100 on the test or I'm a failure, maybe I don't even take the test. If I ask that person out on a date and they say no, then I'm a total loser and I'll never have a partner. Those are big stakes. I might not do anything, right? So that all or nothing thinking puts such pressure on us, it can shut us down. And this ties to the second reason I want to talk about today about why it's so dangerous for us. All or nothing thinking actually increases our anxiety. We have this faulty notion somehow, I think sometimes, that if we think this way, then we'll achieve what we want or we'll be perfect, and then our anxiety will be lowered. But that's false. All or nothing thinking is really an element of perfectionism, which increases our anxiety. If I have to be perfect to be liked, whoa, that's going to be tough. If I have to be perfect to be successful, that's also tough. Nobody is perfect. We are all human. The other thing anxiety does is it causes us to avoid. When we're super, super anxious about something, we might avoid it. People with the highest test anxiety might avoid studying. So it's a little counterintuitive, but anxiety actually shuts us down. And part of both of these two things, right, the increase in anxiety and the fact that it's holding us back in life, show up whenever we're working towards a goal, right? Like let's say you want to run the marathon and you have set out a schedule for yourself of how often you'll exercise, how far you'll run, and what times you hit. And then you have a couple of weeks, you don't feel well, you don't do it. You might abandon the entire plan. Now, that's probably a pretty common scenario for most people. But we feel like if I'm not getting a 95% or 100%, I'm failing. And actually, I heard something I loved recently, which is that 70% is a passing grade. Now, I'm not saying we all want 70% in every area of our lives, but once in a while, it's okay to get 70%. And the third reason this is a really big problem for us is it leads to increased emotional dysregulation, right? If I think like this is going to be perfect and this is going to be horrible, then I'll be like, whoa, really, really excited if this happens, which might lead me to disappointment later because it might not end up being as great as I thought it was, or it might lead me to crash because I'm so disappointed, so upset, and such a failure. So this kind of thinking contributes to our emotions just bouncing all over the place. All right, that was a quick review of the problem, and you're probably here because you know this problem very well. So let's just briefly talk about reality. Reality, nothing, almost nothing is all or nothing. Oops, that's sort of all or nothing thinking, isn't it? Okay, but almost everything is in a gray area. I mean, all of life is gray, right? When you are happy, you might be having happy moments. There might be a little part of your brain that's like, this isn't going to last forever. Or when things are like pretty bad, you might have a part of your brain that's like, this isn't going to last forever. And that kind of thinking actually is not unuseful. It actually can be quite useful to have that little bit of distance from your thoughts and your attachment to what you feel is the successful outcome. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit. But let me take a very concrete example. which is when you're faced with a decision, right? So when we get stuck with decision making, a lot of time we do have an undercurrent of all or nothing thinking. And our decisions are almost always between suboptimal choices. So let me explain that a little bit more. If the choices aren't suboptimal, if one choice is like really clear, really the best, obvious choice, we don't get stuck making a choice, right? It's like, oh, okay, that's the best. Where we're stuck is when we're like, okay, you're shopping for an apartment and you want a sunny apartment in a particular location for a particular price, right? And you go and you look at an apartment and you found one in the exact location, the exact price you want to pay, but it's not really sunny. And then there's another apartment which is not in the location you want, definitely location you don't really want, but the price is good and it's really sunny. Or maybe you find one that's sunny in the neighborhood you want, but the price is too high. So that would be an example of that kind of represents, is what I'm trying to say, most of the choices that make us stuck. We want something perfect. There is nothing perfect. There's nothing perfect in life. So the reality of life is that it's complex, it's nuanced, there's all sorts of different elements involved. And opening our minds to thinking more creatively, to thinking with more acceptance of reality, real acceptance of reality, and awareness can then let some ideas pop in, choices, things we maybe wouldn't have thought of if we stay in our super rigid thinking. So if you've watched other videos on this topic, which I have, you will find that most people are giving you a handful of practical suggestions, which are great, but they don't go deep enough. We often end up in this all or nothing thinking or this perfectionism because of experiences we had early in life where a very deep negative core belief became embedded in us. A negative core belief of, if I'm not perfect, if I don't do this perfect, then I'm worthless, then I'm not a worthwhile human being. Or if I don't make the right choice here, then I'm stupid. So we end up with these negative core beliefs that follow us throughout our whole life. So my first suggestion, which is not like super easy to implement or super concrete, but is probably the most helpful thing because this goes underneath all the rest of it. And that is to identify what your negative core belief is, begin to work with an adaptive, positive core belief, and begin to heal some of that underlying feeling of not being worthy just as you are. So I do have a free PDF and people have found it super helpful, and it walks you through the steps of identifying what your negative core belief is, identifying an adaptive positive core belief. So the adaptive positive belief to work with is a real belief. It's not like made up. It's not like falsifying the entire situation. We're not replacing one cognitive distortion with the opposite, a positive, distortion. We're really trying to look for some adaptive beliefs that are valid. So that PDF kind of walks you through this process and then gives you a handful of techniques to practice it. So the link will be in the description to this video on YouTube. Cognitive distortions are distortions. They're not true. So point number 2 is to begin to experience some distance from your thoughts. I'm going to give you a little bit of guidance about how to do that, but I want to make sure you understand it, right? Because we can be like in our thoughts and we're just totally in them and we're not thinking about the thoughts we're having. Or we can begin to think about the thoughts we're having, and then we can also begin to question the thoughts we're having. Because if we simply think about the thoughts we're having, we might go right back into that loop of like being in that thought, right? Believing it. So with the all or nothing thinking, beginning to identify when you're having it. And if you pay attention to your language, it's probably going to be pretty obvious, but you also can just sort of write down the thinking. You can write down the thinking that's holding you back and then ask yourself, is there a gray area I'm missing here? But if you're able to identify that this is all or nothing thinking, and that means it's a cognitive distortion, and distorted means it's distorted, it's not valid, it's not real. This helps you not believe everything you think, and it begins to help develop that really important observer part of the brain, the wise mind, the part that can pick out the patterns. There I am again in my perfectionist thinking. There I am again in my all or nothing thinking. And I don't have to let my thoughts be me or have me be my thoughts, right? I can separate. And a really good way to do this is using the movie technique. If you are thinking of a scenario where you're saying to yourself, I either get this job or I'm a failure and the rest of my life is ruined, see it as a movie. Put a character on the screen, looks like you, but it's not you, who is feeling that way about a job. And put like a little bit of a beginning to the story. Put what happens next. What happens when that character doesn't get a job? Is their life over? No, there's more to the movie. Let's say this happens particularly at the beginning of the movie, and you are at the beginning of the rest of your life. So at the beginning of the movie, something like that happens, catches your interest, you care about that character, and you want to see them have the fortitude to realize there are other options. There's a gray area here. So the movie technique is a great one for beginning to get some distance and question those thoughts. So tip number 3 is to bring in some humility and realize that you don't always know what is the best thing, right? So when we are so attached to receiving a raise at work or achieving a particular goal or finding the perfect mate, we have that fantasy because we think it's going to make us happy, which maybe it would for a short period of time, but it's almost like we think like, well, then my life will be perfect. Once this happens, my life will be great. And that's just not true. So in my first career, I was very achievement oriented, and I was on Wall Street, as some of you know. And I had already begun this like pattern in my life where I was like, I really want to achieve this. And then I would achieve it, have some momentary happiness. And then it would often be like an, okay, back to the same. Or sometimes I would achieve something I realized pretty quickly thereafter I didn't even want. And then the other thing that happened while I was on Wall Street, one year, 40% of my department got fired. Like, that's a huge amount. I mean, it's a huge number of people. It was pretty traumatic for everybody, but mainly for the people fired, for sure. A number of my friends were fired. Many of them felt like this was the worst thing that ever happened to them. And within about 4 months, they were thinking this was the best thing that had ever happened to them because they weren't really happy at their job. And it gave them the opportunity and the freedom to actually kind of like took away choice, right? So they had to leave and they found something they really loved. So I would say everyone I was friends with, every one of them, felt like that event ended up being the best thing for them at that time. So bringing in this sense of humility of we don't really always know what is best, that can really lower the pressure on us. And it totally undermines that all or nothing thinking because you can't sustain the fantasy of it's all going to be great or it's all going to be horrible because you know it's going to be in between. My 4th tip, have a sense of humor about all of this as much as you can. Our human brains are very, very complicated, and we have a lot of very common thought distortions, very common thinking errors, right? These things have been researched and proven, and all sorts of studies showing all these thinking errors we have. And we can even know these are thinking errors, and we still do them, right? We are so complex. And if we can approach that with a little bit of lightness and a little bit of a sense of a humor, like, oh, wow, there goes my brain again into that all or nothing thinking. You know, here I am again on the gerbil wheel, and I'm going to have a little bit of lightness about it and maybe go do something fun. But just bringing in some sense of humor about how kooky our thoughts can be, because they really can be. And I am not using that term clinically, right? I'm using that term in a very sort of general sense. But sometimes it's like, well, wow, my thoughts can be weird. And seeing it, which goes back to that humility point that I mentioned, seeing it as part of the human condition. So the next time you find yourself stuck in the all or nothing thinking, come on back. You can review these suggestions, or jot them down now, take them with you. I do think they'll help you. Download that PDF. I think that will really help sort of kickstart the process. And if you also find yourself spiraling into catastrophic thinking, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I think next week I'll be releasing a video on how to stop catastrophizing. And if you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.